Welcome to Global Forum for Teacher Educators. We are human rights educators. Global Forum for Teacher Educators. La 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 We are human rights educators. Global Forum for Teacher Educators. La 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 We are human rights educators. Global Forum for Teacher Educators. La 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 la
Hello, and thank you all for being here. As the introduction mentioned, my name is Joseph Levitan. I am the Associate Dean and an Associate Professor at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. It's great to see people from so many different countries, and for all of your greetings. It's nice to be here. Just in terms of getting started, I'd like to make sure that if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the comment section. I do not have any issues interrupting myself if there's a question about clarification, or if you would like me to repeat something. If the microphone isn't working or if I'm speaking too softly, please feel free to let me know as well. And without further ado, first, I also want to thank Dr. Munir for the invitation. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you all. So, the agenda for today, I'd like to talk about student voice research as a way of engaging in classroom improvement practices, in ways of building out democratic engagement, in ways of thinking through the processes for which we can improve education by including students, including the community, to make better educations in schools and in classrooms. Um, One of the things that I'll talk about is how to synthesize student voice research with action research to make sure that any kind of information is going to be actionable and make a concrete and real impact on the classroom, school, or community. And then I'll talk about how professionals can use student voice action research in their classrooms and schools. So, in terms of the background and problem, student voice research and practices have become popular due to their proven efficacy for school improvement and contributions to socially just education. This really means that engaging in student voice research accomplishes 2 to 3 things. One, it improves students' engagement in the classroom. It allows them to feel more engaged. It gives them a voice. It provides democratic opportunities for students to learn about what it means to be a citizen in the classroom, as well as in larger life, in society, in their life, in and beyond schooling. It also allows for school improvement and learning improvement because as science, the science of learning has shown, student engagement improves the cognitive processes for learning and the kind of project-based work that happens during student voice research is a pedagogical approach in and of itself. However, student voice research and practice are still not in the majority of schools, and this is due to a variety of reasons. One of the problems is that oftentimes as teachers, we are overwhelmed. I was a teacher before moving into academia. We're overwhelmed with making sure that we are aligning the curriculum goals with our classroom agendas and our calendars. We need to make sure that we have classroom management. We need to make sure that our activities and our lessons are alignment with the policies and practices of the school. Another problem is that understanding how to do student voice research well and in a good way needs further development. One of the challenges with student voice research is that while it often has a lot of potential and promise, people say, okay, well, that could never work in my classroom, or my kids are a little too rambunctious for this, or how are we going to give so much latitude to students? And one of the things that I'm going to talk about today is that student voice research does not necessarily need to be something that is difficult to accomplish, but there are some deep understandings and some skills that need to be developed in order to do this properly. So, what I'm going to share with you today is the Student Voice Research Framework, which gives the principles of practice for engaging in student voice research well and in a good way, so that students are able to benefit from student voice research as well as the teachers, as well as the school leaders, as well as the community, so that they can benefit from the student voice research framework and student voice research while avoiding some of the common pitfalls and problems that student voice practices sometimes entail. So the student voice research has four interrelated principles. The first one is reflexivity. And as many of you know, reflexivity as a teacher is essential for understanding your own space, your own identities, how that interacts with the students' identities and the classroom itself. But we'll go into that in some greater detail in a second. Another principle is the power dynamics within the classroom or within the school. It's very important to think carefully about power dynamics, and so we'll talk a bit about that. Then we need to think about the contextual relevance of whatever approaches a student voice researcher wants to take in the classroom or in the school in general. So we'll talk about contextual sensitivity. And then finally, the important component of student voice research framework is a deep understanding of what is known as intersubjectivity or mutual understandings. One of the greatest pitfalls in student voice research is that it often has the tendency for the adults in the room to misunderstand what the students are actually saying. As teachers, we are often tasked with imparting knowledge to students, and yet students have a lot of knowledge, contextual knowledge, and insights into the classroom that can help improve practice and their own engagement. And yet we often misunderstand what students are trying to say. And so these four principles together build intersubjective understandings, which is really a core component of great pedagogy. So for principle one in reflexivity, the guiding questions specific for student voice research in terms of reflexivity are: how do your conceptions of youth, the influence of your own childhoods and schooling experiences, and the theoretical choices on the interpretation of students' voices, how do these impact your understanding? So oftentimes we are socialized as teachers to engage in schooling in a certain way. We may have gone to school where we were sitting in rows in a desk and the teacher was talking to us and to impart knowledge and then would call on people who would raise their hands. Some of us may have gone to schools where students would sit in circles rather than in rows and there would be open conversation. These kinds of experiences in our own childhood have affected us in terms of how we then understand ourselves and our roles as teachers and the roles of students. Oftentimes, these socializations change in every generation. And so, one of the things that's important to understand with reflexivity is that we need to be aware of the new contexts. We need to think about our own assumptions, our own values to understand what those are so that we can make sure that those values and those understandings are imparted in a good way, are imparted in a way that fosters learning and fosters engagement and fosters students' sense of well-being and um, development in the classroom. So, as a teacher capacity, it's really important to have a deep conceptualization of reflexivity. So, how do you think about thinking, what's called metacognition? How do you think about how you think about students, youth, and your role as a teacher? So, how do you think about yourself? Are you a facilitator? Are you a sage on a stage? Are you an imparter of knowledge? Are you a guide? These questions need to be thoughtful. Oftentimes, as teachers, we take on all four of these roles, but it's important to be able to apply these roles appropriately to make sure students are learning well. Another point, which is really important here, is the spaces of flexibility and freedom. So reflexivity allows us to understand that sometimes it may be more appropriate to be a guide in a certain subject area or a certain activity rather than somebody who's imparting knowledge or what's known as a sage on the stage. These kinds of choices are made available to us through reflexivity. So reflexivity is one of the foundational principles, not only for student voice research, but for teachers in general. And I think it's really important to think about this specifically in student voice research, because as we'll see, student voice research entails engaging students in asking questions and identifying problems in the classroom, in the school, and society to then collaboratively work together to address those to increase student well-being, student engagement, social justice in schools, or human rights. The second principle is the transformation of power dynamics. So the guiding question specific to student voice research is, being that youth are a non-dominant group, because youth and students are particularly positioned as those who need to learn, who need to be schooled, and that the adults and the teachers are the ones schooling the students, they're considered non-dominant, a non-dominant group. And what does this mean? This means that there are power imbalances between youth and adult researchers. And how do these power imbalances, they're necessary, but they do not have to be extreme and they can be different in different ways. How do these power imbalances need to be transformed so that students are able to really share their ideas, their opinions, their insights in a way that is responsible and free? How can we create spaces for authentic sharing and idea generation in classrooms when the power dynamics are inherently imbalanced? So, what is it that teachers can do to transform the power dynamics so that students feel free to share their insights in a constructive and responsible way? To shift power dynamics so that students understand that they have the freedom and responsibility to make decisions includes engaging in educative listening and conscious positioning. So, what does this mean? Educative listening means that instead of looking for what is wrong in what a student is saying, it means looking for what is right in what a student is saying and identifying areas where the student may have been misinformed or may have made a different kind of um, conceptualization that may not be fully correct, but actually highlighting what is right in what they're trying to say, trying to find the initial impulse. 90% of the time, students are trying to or have some kind of insight. They may not have been able to verbalize it as well as an adult might, or they may not have been able to verbalize it as well as they would like. And so, one of the roles of a student voice practitioner, student voice researcher, is to find what is right in students' voices, because this allows the students to have a shift of power dynamics so that they can know that the teacher is an ally of what the students are trying to understand and can help them critically engage and discard the things that are not correct while highlighting the things that are correct. And this has a profound impact on a classroom because while you are acknowledging what is incorrect about what the student is saying, you are also building the strengths of what the student is saying and finding those important insights so that the student feels more comfortable and confident in sharing those insights and working through their own reasoning process. It is an instant way of giving feedback in the classroom by looking for what is right and what a student is saying rather than only what is wrong. And this conscious positioning of thinking about how to engage in educative listening allows the teacher to become a guide and facilitator rather than an imparter of knowledge. So it's about facilitating learning rather than um, controlling what students are saying to have one right answer, one wrong answer. Instead, you are balancing the power dynamics more so that what the students are trying to say becomes part of the greater dialogue. This is just one example of how the transformation of power dynamics can really engage students and improve student-teacher dynamics so that student voice research can happen in a good way. The third principle is contextual sensitivities to the research design. So guiding questions for this third principle are: how does a teacher design data collection strategies that are congruent with students' contexts, including their cultures, experiences, organizational membership, perspectives, and knowledge? So once we have thought about the transformation of power dynamics, once we have engaged in our own reflexive processes, it's now time to think about how to be contextually sensitive to understand how to engage students in a collaborative research process. There are many different ways of engaging in research. There are workshops, there are narrative structures, there's photo voice, there are interviews, there are focus groups. There are so many different choices that we can make as teachers to engage in student voice research. Oftentimes, the most common are interviews, focus groups, surveys, but there are other kinds like photo voice and narrative engagement or building case studies with students that can be very powerful from the perspective of engaging students in research and identifying challenges and then overcoming those challenges. So one of the things that's important to note here also with student voice research is that there's a continuum of engagement. And sometimes the teacher may say, you know what, this is the beginning of the year. Let's do minimal engagement, but let's start to build some student feedback into the class so that I can understand where students are at, quote unquote, so that I can understand what students are thinking, how they're feeling, and I can tailor some of my pedagogy to be aligned with what students need and how they are thinking about things. And in that case of less engagement, students are respondents. If the teacher wants to engage a little bit more, they can have students come up with ways to have their own mini lessons or to select certain topics amongst a menu. And then that would become a participant perspective. In other cases, the teacher could be engaging with students as an assistant so that they could be having them help out with engaging in the research process or collecting information for a lesson. There are all different kinds of ways of engaging students with different responsibilities and different levels of freedom. At the most engagement spectrum, students are the leaders of their own learning. And that in that case, the teacher takes a step back once the students have shown that they are responsible enough to do this, takes a step back and lets students lead their own engaged processes to make changes in the schools or to come up with policies or come up with practices or lessons. These different kinds of engagement all count as student voice, and it's part of the teacher's or the adult's responsibility to select the kind of engagement that is most appropriate for the age group, the particular dynamic in the classroom, and the ways in which we can engage in the work as teachers and students. Finally, the fourth principle is intersubjectivity, and this is really both a goal and a principle. When engaging with reflexivity, when transforming power dynamics, when thinking about contextual sensitivities for research processes in the classroom, intersubjectivity is the goal, but it is also a principle of making sure that mutual understanding has happened. Intersubjectivity means mutual understanding. So the guiding questions specific to student voice research are: how can teachers be sure that they understand students? And how can they be sure that students understand them? This mutual understanding needs to have certain practices and engagement strategies to make sure that students and teachers understand each other. One of the most powerful ways of developing intersubjectivity in a small scale is to paraphrase back what students are saying. And this is aligned with the educative listening that I mentioned earlier. So educative listening is looking for what's right in students. Sometimes the best way to engage in educative listening is to paraphrase and tweak a little bit about what the student is saying and ask if that is correct. one of the things that paraphrasing allows you to do is it allows you to translate some of the words that the students are saying to your own understanding and mirror that back to the students so that they can see what it is that what they said means to you and vice versa. Classic examples of paraphrasing come in high level negotiations when it comes to conflict resolution. It is a classic use for business negotiations. It is very important to develop good paraphrasing skills and deep listening so that you can develop that kind of intersubjectivity with students that allows you to make sure that you know what they mean and they know what you mean. You can also encourage students to paraphrase what you say back to them so that you can be sure that they understand what you mean. There are other ways to develop intersubjectivity, especially when you lay the groundwork through reflexivity, changing power dynamics, and engagement. But this is just one useful and easy way to make sure that you are developing intersubjectivity with students, which is paraphrasing and asking if you are correct. Now, this is the full example of the student voice research framework. Um, on the left-hand side, you can see students can be co-researchers, they can be leaders, they can be respondents, and they can be facilitators. The goal is to build intersubjectivity with youth through an understanding of power dynamics, your own reflexivity as a teacher and researcher, and looking at the perspectives, cultures, contexts, and experiences of students. One of the important things and one of the valuable things about student voice research is that it allows you to understand the perspectives of diverse student identities, of diverse student experiences. One of the pitfalls in student voice research is that sometimes teachers will pick the most engaged and responsible students and maybe leave out the more troublesome or rambunctious students, and that is one of the things that I would suggest avoiding when doing student voice research. Oftentimes, you can what's called call in students who are more rambunctious and get them to engage better and be more um, learning minded when they are having some ownership of their own processes and learning. So the student voice research framework is part of a book that I co-edited with a colleague. If you're interested, you can look this up. There's a QR code here if you're interested. But I'm going to continue now to talk about how to use student voice research framework in action research to make real tangible um, impacts on the classroom and on the school. So I'm also happy to answer any questions if there are any. Student voice action research is a process of collaborative problem solving and testing to improve learning and classroom dynamics. It uses the student voice research framework to engage in iterative cycles of action and reflection to make constant improvements to areas of practice. Broadening more individualistic approaches, student voice action research focuses on engaging youth to gather information and take collective action. It is designed for social and learning issues, as it is intentionally community driven and builds learning and collective knowledge for action. So merging student voice with action research allows us to think carefully about the ways in which we engage with youth to do action research in the classroom or in the schools. Action research is a paradigm designed specifically for improving learning, addressing social issues, and identifying deep problems in classrooms, in schools, and in society to make a real tangible impact, a positive impact on life. It's an inherently democratic process that is about reconfiguring and reimagining our life worlds to be more socially just, more healthy, and more responsive to our rights and our needs. There are 7 action steps, 8 if you want to think about returning to the iterative cycle. Action research is considered an iterative process. So you start with a series of steps and then you return as in a cycle to that same step to do continuous improvement and continuous engagement in this process to make sure that every year, every cycle, every semester, you are continuing to do this work well. The student voice action research steps are: one, meet with students to identify potential challenges to learning and or community well-being. 2, collect information as a class or section to examine and identify underlying causes for those challenges that were identified in step 1. 3, co-design a course of action to address the cause of those problems. 4, identify ways to know whether the action is successful or not. 5, take the action and adjust as necessary in terms of points 3 and 4 during that cycle of taking action. 6, reflect on the action based on the criteria developed. That is, see if the action was successful, in what ways was it not. 7, identify further challenges or areas of improvement. And 8, start the cycle again. Step 1, meet with students to identify potential challenges to learning and or community well-being. Students often have a good conception of challenges in the classroom, but need proper prompting to be able to share those perceptions in a productive way. Framing the meeting to identify challenging phenomenon rather than identify individuals who may be creating the problems is helpful to get students to start to think about the problem collectively. One of the most important components and one of the easiest pitfalls is that when students are often asked to identify challenging phenomenon, they often point to the teacher, or they might point to a classmate, or they might point to something that is an individual. While that may be the case, framing the problem um, as a phenomenon allows students and the teacher to think more deeply than one individual. For example, and there are a couple reasons for this. One reason is that it's usually not one individual. If it's just one individual, it wouldn't be a problem. But usually what happens is that individual who is acting in a way that is disruptive, for example, may be affecting other individuals. So it's never just a one person issue when there is an issue in the classroom or in the school. It is a multi-person issue because there's a person or a phenomenon that is affecting everybody else. And if those other folks were not sensitive to what that person was doing, it would not be a problem. So it's important to think more about the phenomenon. One of the things that often happens in the early stages, especially in the middle school grades or the elementary school grades, the students will talk about how a classmate or colleague would be, or a classmate in elementary school would be doing something that's unfair. They're not sharing, or they're not engaging in a activity in a fair way. That kind of statement is not as helpful as saying, okay, what does it mean to have a classroom where everybody is treated fairly? That phenomenon, where you can identify a phenomenon where fairness is not always present in the classroom, is a much deeper engagement in what the problem is, and doesn't just point the finger at one person, because it is often likely that fairness is not always present from multiple actors. So this is why framing um, the meeting to identify challenging phenomenon is really important. And students are capable of doing this even from the ages of 8, 9, or 10. It's just a matter of the teacher facilitating this. In high school, it is a bit easier. In high school and secondary school, it is much more compelling for students to think about the underlying causes of some of these things. So it could be different groups of students may have some kind of conflict, or there may be some kind of issue in terms of the lunch menu, or something else that is more socially oriented. Instead of thinking about an individual, it's more important, and students are happy to think more about the systems or the underlying phenomena. Another thing that's important is to have a brief lesson on constructive feedback. And there are many ways, many places to find lessons on constructive feedback and what it means to do constructive feedback, but it'd be worthwhile to make sure that that happens so that students are engaging in their interpersonal dynamics in a healthy way and changing those power dynamics. Some of the processes for this is using photos, drawings, stories, case studies, or other activities to help get students talking. At the end of step 1, coming to consensus on 1 to 3 issues to work on is most effective. It's usually good to have at least 2, but between 1 and 3, you do not want too many. But identifying 1 to 3 issues in the classroom or in the school or in society that students want to work on is a good way to give enough variety to do effective work. Step 2 is to collect information as a class section to examine and identify underlying causes for the challenges. Once 1 to 3 problems are identified, certain individuals are tasked with examining the deeper causes and collecting information from community members. Then the smaller group reports back to the larger group. This is just classic distribution of tasks, and it's important to give students a little bit of freedom and responsibility to see if they can do this. When it's something real, students are much more likely to take this seriously. And so when there's a real change that can happen, at my experience, and I've done this many, many times, dozens, over 40, 50 times, students are really keen to do this work and do it well. And it helps them develop other competencies that are important for other parts of academic life. The analysis should look at the ecology of a problem, or all of the different components of a problem, as well as who is harmed and who benefits from any problem. Focusing on the tensions is important. Once you get the general underlying phenomena, it is then impossible to focus on actors rather than just phenomenon. But the same constructive feedback, not looking at individuals specifically by naming them, but thinking about who is acting in what way, should be used, and avoid singling out any one person, as it is very rare that only one person is the deep root of an issue. It's usually something that is interpersonal. Once consensus is reached on underlying causes, begin to plan collective action. So, for example, let's say that for the um, ways of engaging in the process of making a classroom more fair, they realize that the norms within the classroom itself have not been clearly identified about what is fair. And so once a consensus is reached that the underlying cause is that there are um, the underlying causes are that there's not a consensus on what is fair, then the students can start to do a little bit of research on what constitutes fairness, what constitutes rights, what constitutes agreements and contracts, to make sure that students are then able to understand what it means to act in a fair way. Step 3, design a course of action to address the cause. Based on the deep identification of the problem, plans for addressing it often arise quickly, such as in the example I just mentioned. Engage in brainstorming and modeling the potential solutions to think about implications and effects, both positive and negative, prior to any large-scale implementation. The challenge with students is mobilizing collective action and assigning tasks, as well as ensuring feasibility. So in the example of students thinking about what is fairness, you could have students divide into 4 or 5 groups to examine different conceptualizations of fairness, rights, responsibilities, and have them think about what frameworks they could use in their classroom to ensure that there's fairness. Part of the conversation should be identifying possible levers of change that do not overburden anyone. This work can be integrated into lessons so that students are developing competencies. So, for example, in this um, situation with fairness, students could write out a report about how there's a conceptualization of fairness that's individualistic versus a conceptualization of fairness that is collectivistic. Even students at the ages of 8, 9, and 10 can understand these concepts, and while they're simple, when they're simple, the processes of that are part of doing this kind of work well. So thinking through how to make it simple enough for students, but also showing that this would help with communication, with thinking about civics, and addressing different competencies depending on the ministry or Department of Education competencies that you may be working with. Step 4 is to identify ways to know whether the action is successful or not. What are the experiences students and teachers would want to show that this is successful? What are the facts that should be seen to know that the change process is successful? And how will the students test or understand whether the action has been successful? What is the timeline for this to be successful or not? So in the example of the classroom fairness, it may take 2 weeks for students to do some research online in books, ask some other adults, and come up and write a report. Then there could be a timeline for students to say, okay, we're going to come up with this with our own classroom norms to make sure there's fairness. And then you can ask students, okay, so what would fairness look like? And so if somebody does something, one of the things they could say, which is something that's happened, if somebody does something that's unfair, they do a kind of retribution or a restorative practice to make sure that they make it whatever they did that was unfair right. And if we can see that this has been happening over the course of the semester, then we can know that this has been working. Step 5 is take action. Based on the timeline and the distributed task, take actions and follow up regularly. Adjust actions if necessary, ensure mutual accountability. So, for the example of the students with the fairness and the rules in the classroom, if a rule turns out to be misunderstood or understood in a way that some students have different understandings of, you can change the rule as the problem arises. This is during the time of taking action. So these adjustments are important because it allows you to identify problems in a quick way, in a nimble way, and address them rather than letting them linger for too long. Steps 6 and 7, reflect on the action. Once the action and the timeline have been completed, reflect on the action from the criteria developed and identify further challenges or areas of improvement. Once the work is completed and there has been enough time, reflect as a group on the action taken. Identify successes and areas for improvement to create another iteration. So, for example, in the case of the fairness in the classroom, it could be that there's a timeline of one semester where the students come up with a set of group norms. They come up with a set of actions or experiences that they want to see, and then at the end of the semester, they can reflect on how did it work, are there still issues, and what do they need to do in the future to make it better. This kind of work and this kind of reflection allows students to feel engagement in the classroom, allows them to be held mutually accountable for their own behaviors in the classroom, and allows the teacher to make sure that they can see how the classroom dynamics are playing out. So, what are the strengths and weaknesses of student voice action research? Some of the strengths are that students are driving the processes, and these processes can be done in conjunction with other tasks. So, one of the nice things about student voice action research is that it actually allows students to engage in project-based learning. It allows students to do independent work and research, it allows students to work on communication skills. And in some cases, such as when students wanted to build a garden outside of the classroom because they wanted healthy vegetables, it allows them to work on biology and mathematics because they actually did the measuring and the preparation for the garden. So there are lots of ways that this kind of work integrates with the other kinds of learning goals that are part of a general curriculum. Um, this kind of work is also nice because it allows students to feel like their actions have a concrete impact, which improves their sense of agency, their sense of self and well-being, and their sense of involvement and engagement with the class. The process builds in adaptation adjustments to address incorrect assumptions. One of the things that we talked about in terms of the student voice research framework is that we need to make sure that our assumptions are questioned through reflexivity and that we make a correct identification of what students mean and what teachers mean to make sure that the processes are accurate and that they are actually improving students' engagement and well-being and learning. Um, the the adaptation and the ability to adapt rather than sticking to something that doesn't work is really key because one of the things that students often complain about is that they feel stuck when they see something that doesn't work and yet it doesn't change year after year. And so this is one ways to be more responsive to students. Um, once started, Another strength is that once started, the process builds in momentum and can be built into classroom structures. So once the hard work of getting students to learn the process starts, it's a really powerful way to ensure students continue to be engaged and that your classroom continues to be responsive. So the hardest part is getting started. But a strength of this is that once it's started, students begin to expect it because they realize that it's such a good way for them to have a better learning experience. And it's a good way for you as a teacher to also have a better teaching experience. And this momentum, in my experience, is allows you to have a little bit more freedom and a little bit more classroom management throughout the school year. And so that's one of the greatest strengths I've found in this kind of work. Um, this supports students' development of responsibility, critical thinking, collaboration, analytical skills, and done so in a way that's a low stakes activity because it's not a tested subject area. It allows students to develop this through trial and error. It allows them to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and correct those mistakes before any kind of final tests or any kind of activity that might be graded in a way that has some kind of summative quality. There are weaknesses, however. Um, One of the weaknesses is that the interpersonal skills of the students and the facilitators makes or breaks this process. So as a teacher, each classroom is different, each group of students is different, and sometimes this process can be successful with one group of students and may not be successful with another group of students. So it's important to be very, again, reflective and thoughtful about what group of students you have and how to facilitate it. It may also mean that sometimes you need to have more um, staged step-by-step processes with one group because they need a little bit more guidance, while another group might be able to jump straight into doing more self-directed student voice action research. Another weakness is that it can be time-consuming and difficult to get the processes started because there is a learning curve, like I mentioned before. But once it gets started, its own momentum is very powerful. So it's a part of the weaknesses is just being able to try this out and get this going. Um, as a teacher, and that can be a little bit frustrating, but once you get it going, it's very powerful. So one of the challenges with that is if you find frustration at the beginning, it may turn teachers off to doing it in the future. There's a lot of uncertainty and need to adjust during the process. So sometimes teachers really like structure. Some people also just like structures, including students. And part of this is building flexibility into the structure. And so sometimes that flexibility can make people uncomfortable. But once you see that that flexibility has its own structure in it, it can be very useful. But opening up some of the structure to flexibility can be daunting at the beginning. Um, and when there is not proper facilitation, it can generate conflict with students. And so it's important to take this step by step and make sure that conflict is resolved as students start to engage us by thinking about how to proactively engage in educative listening, in reflection, in facilitation processes, in creating constructive feedback and communication norms so that students can develop that intersubjectivity. Because oftentimes when there's intersubjectivity, conflict gets reduced. Most conflict is through misunderstandings. And so once you can develop a foundation of mutual understanding, when there's different interests and different needs and different wants, that can be negotiated. Most of the time, the conflict is when the students don't understand each other or they don't understand the teacher. I see that there are now a couple questions and I'm almost finished, so I'm happy to answer those in a second. How can teachers use student voice action research to address classroom issues? Student voice action research is designed to address classroom and school issues, especially via capacity building and student collective action. It is designed to be inherently ethical to mobilize community identified needs, and it can be a challenge for various reasons, but when successful, it can make sustainable and impactful changes to classroom and schools. So it can the flexibility of student voice action research allows for both classroom focused, school focused, as well as community focused identification of needs and collective action. And that work can really make a profound impact on the culture of the school because it can make positive impact on showing concrete, real improvements that can become positively contagious. So if you're more interested in action research, there's also a free podcast that we have that's called the Action Research Podcast. So feel free to uh, share, check out that QR code. And now here's some of the questions. So, what kind of support or training do students and teachers need to conduct meaningful action research? I think in terms of support, it is helpful to have somebody who has done the activity before to help be a facilitator and guide. There are a number of books on action research. There's a book called Action Research, the Handbook of Action Research by Stringer and Aragon. It's published by Sage that has some really great tips and ideas. Um, and there are also networks of action researchers on Facebook, on social media, who might be able to help facilitate kind of some of their own learning and help guide teachers through the initial stages of the practice. Once you have one or two iterations of that practice, that can really help you develop your own skill set. But it is helpful to have somebody kind of be a co guide or a thought partner as you start to engage in this. It does not need to be too time intensive, but it is useful to have somebody to share your ideas with. Next question, how does incorporating reflective practices in classroom teaching impact the personal and professional grooming of students? So incorporating reflective practices in classroom teaching is really helpful for a number of reasons. One, it cultivates metacognition, which is the ability to think about your own thinking or your own emotions. And one of the things that metacognition does in terms of preparing personal and professional uh, capacities in students is that it allows them to have some reflective space, to take a moment to understand their own thoughts, not as what needs to happen right now or in this moment, but as one of many potential thoughts. And so creating that space is really valuable because it gives students a moment of mindfulness to be able to then select a course of action rather than reacting. So the goal of reflection is to be able to be responding and understanding multiple possibilities rather than reacting and only engaging in one reaction that may or may not be productive. What is the role of reflective daily? What is the role of a reflective diary in action research, and how can we analyze that data in research? Should we add the whole reflective diary in data analysis? So that's a great question. The role of a reflective diary in action research is really to get a sense of what you're thinking, feeling, and what your different options may or may not be in a particular space or a particular day. The great thing about reflective diary and action research is that it is your action, it is your reflection time. And one of the core components of action research is action and reflection or praxis. A diary is a different way of thinking than just doing your own internal monologue work because writing is actually a different kind of thinking than your own self-reflection. So a reflective diary is actually another deep way of doing that kind of reflection for yourself when it comes to processing what happened, what needs to change, what has gone well, what has not, what the options are, and starting to identify multiple avenues for the future. Um, in terms of data analysis, it is useful to refer back to the reflective diary, but there will be parts of the reflective diary that may or may not be useful, and you can discard some of that. Sometimes you have spurious ideas, and that is important to think through. But you would want to engage in data analysis on your reflective diary and then bring that reflective diary into your data analysis with the rest of the action research. Um, there was a question that was present before that I thought was important. How to handle ethical approval matters. Need proposal writing, please advise. So there are a number of articles coming out about ethical approval. It depends on the university. It depends on the school. There are different components of this, but there are, depending on the context, most of the time it is a low stakes, minimal harm or no harm activity. So it's usually fairly straightforward, but it depends upon the different norms of each country and university. How can we integrate into students' capstone projects? So that's a great question. If you're talking about students in elementary school, secondary school, or university, in university, it's very easy to do this as a capstone project. Um, Oftentimes, the students can take on different roles within a larger action research project, or they can come up with their own. At McGill, we have capstone projects where students regularly engage in action research for our teacher preparation program because teachers are already teaching. And so they engage in a action research project as their capstone while they are in their internships or in their full-time classroom spaces. So for practitioners, it's fairly straightforward. For students, it can in undergraduate or in secondary school, um, it can be a really great way to have students apply their learning to a specific case and have them come up with some kind of concrete product and test that product out and then report on the findings. How to manage conflict in community-based teaching. These are students, those will be temporarily in connection to complete micro-learning of concepts. The time available is short between students and educators within the period of micro-learning duration. Micro-learning is very hard to do for action research because action research necessarily takes a lot of time. Um, the components of student voice research, however, can take a little less time. So in micro settings, engaging in the principles of thinking about power dynamics, intersubjectivity, doing the paraphrasing, doing educative listening, that stuff can happen in micro learning context to set the stage and be proactive. So I would recommend making sure that you set the stage by proactively saying, here's how I want to make sure we all understand each other. I'm going to engage in educative listening where I'm going to try to find what is right and what you're trying to say and my understanding and paraphrase that back to you. And please let me know if this is correct. And we can do this as a way of leveling the power dynamics a little bit so that students feel engaged and empowered to ask the questions and contribute their knowledge productively. How can the teaching staff at 8 to 12 class male adolescents, college level, create an environment where their actions align with their teachings to effectively model personal grooming preparation for students? Um, I'm trying to let's see, college level create an environment where an actions align with teaching. So that's a great question. A lot of the great work in action research is that it is a kind of a way to model or provide the examples for students to show how this can work. One of the important things that we've seen in the science of learning is that students are much more aware and attuned to the actions of the teachers or the adults around them rather than what they say. And so what you're pointing to is really important because if you create the school itself in a way that is using action research or democratic practices, and each of the staff are engaging in those behaviors, that is really powerful in terms of preparing students to not only understand it intellectually, but also to live that model because modeling those principles is the most powerful pedagogy. So if you are in a school where you're working with adolescent males and all the teachers are following the same, I think it would be important for the school to kind of get together to understand kind of what the shared norms and expectations are, and that the teachers are actually modeling those behaviors amongst each other with students and with teachers. Um, and I think we are getting close to out of time. There was one other question, but it looks like um, some concluding remarks. I think it's great that this kind of forum exists, that we can share different ideas. One of the important things as teachers around the world is that we share different ideas and that we recognize that each of these ideas may work in some contexts and may not work in other contexts. Part of the idea of free sharing of this knowledge is that each teacher is an expert in their own classroom. I cannot speak to one teacher's classroom if I do not know it. And it's really important for each of us to take some of this information and think about, okay, in my own expertise and my own knowledge, can this work? How might it work? And what is this knowledge going to be able to do for my particular space? Adapting any kind of information to a context, because education is deeply contextual, is one of the core competencies that we as teachers do all have and need to have, and that we engage in all the time. So I think that this free sharing of knowledge is a really great opportunity for that because it allows us to have that kind of exchange and to engage in these kinds of practices. Thank you all very much for your great questions, and thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.